Good afternoon, everyone. You're all very welcome to the gallery for this event at the Olivier Cornet Gallery. Those of you watching, or rather listening at home, all you should be able to see is a black rectangle, and that's all right. It's intentional. That's all you're going to see. So just pump up the volume, and you're more than welcome. And so, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our two speakers for today, for today's event. Ciara O'Flaherty is a sociologist, art historian, and artist. She's interested in fundamental questions surrounding the nature of art. She began researching art collection as part of her studies at Trinity College Dublin to challenge sociology's dismissive approach to these dilemmas. She's no collector. Her study is also an expression of her wish to further understand the interplay of creativity and consumption, a relationship which continues to gain relevance in a society seemingly determined to endlessly promote the latter. Keely McLavin is currently a full-time student and a practicing artist. She's in her third year of her fine art BA in TUD. As I said, she's a practicing artist, primarily working with paint and drawing. Her practice revolves around social and political issues, as well as personal issues with identity, mental health, and gender. She's been volunteering at the Olivier Cornet Gallery for the last couple of months. So Ciara and Keely, the floor is all yours.
Okay. So Olivier just introduced me. I'm Keely. I have a big Irish accent, so you'll understand. But yeah, the first question I wanted to ask you, because this is something that I've spoken to you about before and found really interesting, is why study art history and sociology?
So that actually happened as an accident, which is mostly how things happen, I think, with studying. But I went in, I wanted to study art history, that was my big goal. And I was looking at the combinations for what you could study art history with. And I really wanted to do psychology, but that wasn't an option. So the most fascinating option that stood out to me was sociology. And then when I started doing sociology, I just kind of fell in love with it, I suppose. So I was really enamored with the explanatory power and like the way that we build theory in sociology is really fascinating. So there's a lot more crossover than you would think between sociology and art history. It's, you know, the tools from both can add to each other and create like, you know, different things from sociology can help you explain certain art historical objects or narratives and stuff like that, and vice versa, surprisingly enough. So yeah, it was something that kind of just happened as an accident, like I said, but organically kind of grew into more.
Yeah, because I remember like we spoke about before, and we were saying that kind of sociology somewhat rejects art and art movements, but there is so much crossover. So like that's why when I met you, I found it so interesting that you did both, because I was like, oh my god, this is amazing. Like now I can talk to somebody who's in the exact same spot as I am. So yeah. I think as well I wanted to ask you why you decided to do your thesis on art collecting and like what made you interested from like the sociological perspective of art collecting.
So I encountered Bourdieu's theory of cultural capital in second year, and while I found it incredibly convincing, I really wanted to disprove it because it kind of it takes away from this personal, visceral, real experience and emotions that you get when you're looking at art and when you're really, you know, into art. So I was like fascinated by it. It was very interesting, but also this like idea of art engagement as just like a function of class didn't quite sit right with me. So I then looking at like who engages with art, arguably the most active engagement is that of collectors, because purely from a resource point of view, they are the ones that will invest time and energy and also money, which is, you know, in the rational world, the most important resource, but into this pursuit. So they kind of logically would be the ones to ask. And then as it went on and as I started to research more into them, I realized that they have their interesting in and of themselves. It's an interesting thing to do because in like a world that values like extreme rationality and logic and all this kind of thing. And if you went out into the street right now and you asked somebody, would you ever pay X amount for a work, like say one of Yanni's works that's on the walls, they might look at you kind of funny. And a society in which you can expect somebody in the street to look at you funny for suggesting paying money for art is interesting in its own right. But what I was interested in this research was talking to collectors and unearthing how they counteracted that narrative in society within themselves and how they justified it.
Okay, no, that's actually really interesting. Okay. So I guess like the next thing I wanted to ask you was to expand on the idea of art collecting as a form of self-expression. Because like I thought that was like such a well-written part of your thesis. I was like, oh my God, that's such a good point. Like, because I know artists themselves use their art as a form of expression, and catharsis, I find anyway. And artists themselves are usually like visually very expressive people. But I thought like the idea of using your art taste and your art collection as a form of self-expression as well, similar to how you dress, very fascinating. So could you expand on that?
Of course, I think that it's such an interesting thing. It's not something that I got to go into in any great detail, unfortunately. But yeah, it's so interesting on the other end of the like creative consumption scale to have purchasing be a creative choice. So it was kind of like a difficult topic to kind of get into. So for like I'm thinking of one collector specifically mentioned, and I don't think this made it in, but that his family member was a creative, but he wasn't in any way. So this was his way of expressing it. And I don't know whether that was just his interpretation or it was genuinely true that, you know, this is just how he got out his creative urges. But I think that seeing like an art collection as a mode of self-expression is really interesting because a lot of collectors express this desire for like wide accessibility to art, but for their own collections as like a private thing. So then the question becomes, are you reflecting, do you have something that you express, like the way you dress or something? Is that more important that reflects yourself to others or it reflects you back to yourself? So an art collection on your own walls might mean one thing about self-expression, but if you insist on having it shown in the gallery, or you know you want to open a foundation, I mean that only happens to the top collections. But it's really interesting. Like, are you more interested in this? This did happen where some collectors were very intent on sharing with their friends and family, and others built a private wing in their house so that they could have it themselves and had no desire to like invite people over to show. So very, very interesting mode of self-expression.
Like
private.
The spectrum of like wanting it to be a form of self-expression, whether that's like external or internal or private or public, is like I find that really interesting in on itself. Of like who determines that, like what changes your mind, why do these people do it this way and these people do it a different way, and like I just thought like I flagged that in your thesis. I was like, that's actually like a really interesting point, especially from like an artistic perspective of art being used as a form of self-expression, because you're obviously your art is probably like to me as an artist one of the most personal things you could express. So I thought like art collecting, like you said, like this consumption being also a form of self-expression and like showing your taste. I just found that really interesting, so I wanted to ask about it. And I guess like this kind of segues into the next question of, you were talking as well about like early exposure in childhood to like cultural capital. So like reading, literature, cinema, like museums, galleries, stuff like that. And I guess like I wanted to know if that kind of early exposure to cultural capital kind of predisposes you almost to becoming part of the art community, whether you're a creator or a collector or work in the industry. So
That's Borges' kind of whole thesis, that you know, as kids, when you come to be opened up to these cultural capital experiences, that kind of stuff, that you are brought into this system of reproducing social hierarchy via the internalization of that cultural capital, which is like legitimized as good taste, in quotation marks. But yeah, it's fascinating. I can't say that I proved or disproved that early exposure is correlated to membership of the artistic community, because again, it was a qualitative study. It's not something that looks for indisputable fact. It looks for interpretations and experiences of the people being interviewed. So there are other research methods that I could employ maybe later down the line that would like make claims that are closer to that. But with the aims of this research, it was more about finding out. But I mean, I think that there were some collectors who had like a delayed introduction to art. So maybe that they became interested, or even a delayed expression of their interest into art. So like pensioners that started going to art groups in their 50s. So it was something that kind of came up later for them. Whereas the Bourdieusian conclusion would be that people are going to go towards art regardless. Like this is just what they've been conditioned to do. But so I thought that was really interesting. So it didn't really account for every entry and every type of entry into the becoming a member of the art community.
Yeah, the next couple of questions I have for you are kind of like in a similar kind of sphere as well. Of like, I became interested in like what was the difference between this familiarization in childhood or like an educational familiarization, because I remember us two spoke briefly about it before, about there's a certain type of language around the art world that it's like in early childhood, if you're exposed to this cultural capital, you have an easier time inserting yourself into this community. Where like if you go to school and this is the first time you're hearing this, it's very much so like these blocks are set in place already. So I kind of wanted to ask, like, in your opinion, what's the difference? Like, how would it affect somebody in being familiarized in childhood and getting an educational familiarization?
So this is one of the main kind of ideas that Bourdieu talks about that I'm kind of like a bit iffy on. But as a theory, it's very convincing. The process of familiarization with the so-called objects of taste. So the objects of taste tend to be very expensive things, like art or luxury goods, that kind of stuff. So the early familiarization is what Bourdieu calls the privilege mode of acquisition. So these people are more likely to display comfort around these things and nonchalance. So walking into a room full of art is not something big to them, whereas to lower classes or people who learned about art maybe from an outside source rather than their parents or rather than having art in the house, there's more of a reverence. That you notice when you go into a gallery is people treat it like a church, and people will whisper around art and that kind of stuff. So the privilege mode of acquisition is being able to touch the artworks in your own home, which to lower classes might seem like insane. And the educational mode of acquisition would be learning about things in terms of categories and labels. So you come at art from a very analytical approach, which, like, as an art history student, I definitely noticed, so that was how I was approaching art, instead of, having this rhetoric of good taste, good natural taste that I was bringing to the table on my own, which Bourdieu would say is internalized cultural capital from being really familiar with art from an early age. So I'm talking a lot about Bourdieu, but
that's what you wrote about,
So whether I found indicators that was necessarily true for everybody, I don't know that I found that I could say that I completely believe that, but also I'm not really the person to ask, because I think it would be more interesting to get an answer for that question from, say, a gallerist who encounters a lot of different types of art consumers.
Of course,
And you can talk about the level of familiarity with art divided by class, divided by, or like the mode of acquisition. But it's really fascinating that among the people who know art, there is that divide of like, there's still a class distinction.
Yeah,
So, or it's said it's a class connection with. Yeah.
Yeah, because I notice like even in my own like day to day, there's there's this kind of different attitude with people who grew up in this environment and this people who are now just entering into the education for the first time, and there's this kind of like confidence around these people who've grown up with this, and like you said, like a familiarization with it, like comfortability, like in comparison to people who are learning for the first time. And I just found like that really interesting when I was reading through your writing. And I was like, oh, this is actually something I've noticed as a practicing artist. And it's interesting that a sociologist has also noticed this. So yeah, and I guess like the next thing I wanted to ask, this kind of is more to do with taste, I guess, because sociology, everyone's been socialized to think a certain thing and have certain opinions and stuff like this. But I wanted to ask, do you think that whether you're a creator or a consumer of art, what you are creating or purchasing, do you think that's organic taste? Do you think that's just somebody's actual personal opinion? Or do you think actually we have been socialized to think this is what we should like, or this is what we should be creating? And I just kind of wanted to ask you if you found out anything about that.
I would say that in the study is not something that I like really looked for, but in terms of the taste that came up, I would say that people who had parents that had been interested in art, it was either very clearly that they really hated what their parents had collected, or really loved it and really were trying to get back to it. So I think for me that portrays a little bit more of a psychological edge to collecting, because there is more of a, are you trying to get back to the relationship with your parents, or are you trying to get away from it?
Yeah.
So, but in terms of like taste and creativity and consumption, I don't think, I mean, it's very sociologist of me to say it, but I don't think there's any way we can get out of society or we can opt out. So I think that everything we do is a social act. So art is a social act, whether it's in terms of the creative act or the consumptive act. You know, that we take things from a position that has been, you know, made by society for us, or not for us, but it's in everything that we do. So I think that creativity is unfortunately not independent of that.
Yeah, like I find it so interesting, just from like an artistic point of view, but like it's, to me, it's like I find a lot of art and a lot of artists kind of are like really trying to break out of that system, and a lot of their art is like a protest almost to this thing that we've grown up in, but like by default, the art they're creating is what's accepted by society, and the art that is seen as amazing or outstanding or innovational is only seen that way because society have allowed it to be seen that way. And I just found like that kind of interesting, just from like us having personal conversations, but also like in your writing, I was like, oh, okay, this is kind of good actually. I guess like something I wanted to ask as well is you brought up like aesthetic value and how society as a whole will have an aesthetic value on a piece, but I wanted to ask if you think or you found that added economic value, so something that's of a higher economic value, also adds to the aesthetic value of the piece, or do you think they correlate at all, or are they completely separate?
I think this is a fascinating question, first of all. But Veblen would say that, you know, the price of an object is inherently going to affect our opinion of it, and inherently affect how beautiful or how valuable we think it is. So, like the Veblen goods of like Louis Vuitton and like luxury items and anything connected with celebrity. And that's not only to do with money either. I think Watts did a study in like 2006 where they created a like market online for music that you could, but they created hundreds of these different markets, and you could see what people were doing, you know, which tracks they were listening to, and you know, they created an experiment based off this, and they found that what people listen to, people you don't know, strangers, will affect what you listen to and what you think is good music. So it doesn't even matter, you know, your personal taste. It comes down to like what society as a whole thinks. But I think that Veblen goods have similarities in the art market. I think that, you have your blue chip names and your big status kind of artists that are always going to sell at this range, right? But those artists are most likely going to be the ones in 20 or 30 years who are important to art history. Not only because at the time the market recognizes that they are somewhat valuable, but because now that there's a vested interest in keeping them valuable. So the market and art history are kind of intrinsically linked in that way. So it becomes so like you cannot get out of the fact that art buying is art history in a way. But art history is kind of obscured that for ages, but it's so important for a piece to have someone buy it.
Yeah, of course.
And not just someone, like it's who buys it, why.
Yeah.
And that goes outside art buying. Like if we didn't have Theo Van Gogh and his wife promoting Vincent, like we might not know he sold one piece in his life. But then with art buying, you have Durand Ruel who like bought all the Impressionist paintings, and the Impressionists would not be anywhere without him. But also, if somebody wasn't bought by him, they're not considered an Impressionist in the same way.
Yeah.
So it's really important who buys it. So what I'm saying is, art, it cannot be separated in terms of history from transaction and economic exchange, and kind of calling a little bit of BS on art history for that. So yeah, but it's so interesting. But like, do I think inherent value is affected by economic value? Absolutely not. But without even considering my personal opinion on that, seeing that it's intensely complex and messy to try and value art from that kind of perspective.
Yeah, because like I find, like, I don't know, I would have not as much like background on any of this stuff as you would, but like I find that if an artist is selling from well, they're seen as successful, even if their artwork is not as good as people think it is, you know. And I kind of like that in your writing, because I was like, oh, this is actually really interesting, because like I've seen this and this end, and like I wanted to ask you because obviously you're going to have a lot more to say about it than I would. But yeah, I guess like final questions, it's just like, you know, what did you find from your study? Do you think you're going to continue researching it? Or like, was there anything that you found like particularly interesting during your research? Because I know you did interviews with several different gallerists and collectors. And I guess I kind of just wanted to know the gossip. Like, was there anything particularly interesting that you found?
Yeah, so there was things that I found that were, you know, like these are all indicators, by the way. Like again, it's not saying that this is how all collectors value art. You know, it's an indication that some collectors, specifically the ones, the 15 that I interviewed, you know, value art in that specific way. However, there were some themes that didn't surprise me. So themes about memory and like the self-expression, that kind of stuff, and extending yourself into your objects, which I kind of from my reading had expected, and memory in terms of like having an almost diary in terms of like a visual diary on your wall. I expected that, but there were things like completion and dispossession and shame, especially, which really kind of caught me off guard. So in terms of completion, there was like a lot of ways in which people aspired towards completion of their collection, or completion of their like a representation of their own taste, and or that kind of stuff. So like having a blueprint to what they like, which is really interesting, whether they want to show it to themselves or show it to other people. And there was also like the completion of fate and destiny, which for me, I was like, wow, this is really interesting. But like the idea that this work is supposed to be with me. So kind of pseudo-religious like interaction. So that was really interesting. I don't think, and then also like care beyond the work, so beyond your own like passing, to, you know, see the future of the work is like as very important. So it's like kind of martyrdom in a way, but at the same time, like it goes back to religion, but like it's not worship. People see it more as like a friendship between like the collector and the collected. So because there's this real reciprocity with the works, I found that really interesting. And then shame was so interesting because it was like this self-regulating cycle, because people justified, you know, themselves being connected to this elite act, which is where the shame came from, that it was elite, which is contrasting to this idea of class, like a class function of buying art. So that was exciting to find.
Yeah.
But the shame and the self-regulation via saying that it's a socially responsible act and that you're supporting artists and all that kind of stuff is just really, really interesting, because collectors are a pillar of the artistic community, whether kind of people acknowledge them or not. And the idea that, you know, you can have these conversations and you can say these things to collectors and ask them like hard questions about why, and not have the pillar like crumble, you know, because they self-regulate, they know what they're doing, they're self-aware, and they're happy to keep doing it. Is great, because that's not like artists are a lot more prone to doubt and that kind of stuff. So it's great to have one pillar that's like kind of stable.
Yeah.
But
we need someone to keep us up, like.
so yeah, I mean, there was loads of stuff. Like there's loads of things that I didn't even get to like put a line in the dissertation about. So interesting, so fascinating. We could talk for hours about it.
Do you think you will like continue researching this in any way? Like, I don't know if you're going to continue like with an MA or a PhD or whatever, but do you think in the future you'll come back to this kind of area of research?
I think definitely. I think after hopefully the last lockdown
Yeah.
ended, I needed to come out from behind my laptop.
Yeah.
So I think right now, like the work that I'm working quotation marks of, that I'm doing on it is like mental and like experiential. So it's very much kind of like taking a step back from it now. But I think you can kind of tell that I really love this and I really love talking about it. So I think I won't be able to escape doing more work on it. So what that kind of looks like in the future is still in flux. But if there are any collectors listening that would like to give me their accounts and like have a chat, I would be absolutely honored to hear them out.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think going forward we'll see if I'm focusing more on my actual art practice.
Yeah,
which
of course.
is great.
Like it's such an interesting perspective that you're coming from of doing the art historian stuff, the sociological stuff, and now you're also a practicing artist. Like it's just like a lot, you know. Because even when I was reading it, like I have very small qualifications in sociology and I did the art stuff. So like meeting you, I was like, oh my God, this is the first person I've met who has a similar background to me. I can actually talk about this stuff now.
So saying what I mean, I was like, yes, you're gonna get it.
But no, like I'm genuinely so honored to interview. Like I thoroughly enjoyed the dissertation. Like I read it all in one sitting. I was like immediately like, oh my God, like you can see my little tabs. I was like, this is so interesting. Like I'm just gonna have like loads of little highlights and everything. So, but thank you so much for coming in. So I guess I'm just, if anybody has any questions, now is the time. If anyone has questions online as well, now is the time. I don't know.
Actually, I have a question. This is Olivia here. I'm the gallerist. I think it's really important to also explain, obviously, that you sort of surveyed people who identify as art collectors, right?
Mm-hmm.
As a gallerist, obviously, I would interact with a lot of people who not necessarily identify as art collectors, but they would be part of this art buying public. And I'm just wondering if that would be of interest to you to actually, at some stage, also kind of interview that category of buyer who basically don't necessarily identify as art collectors. Because as a gallerist, I can honestly say that not a single buyer is the same whether they identify as art collectors or not.
Mm-hmm. So just for the live, the question is whether I'd be interested in art buyers as well as art collectors. And actually, yes, the title kind of refers to that, she's no collector, because there's this resistance and this shame to the title of collector. So that is really, really interesting. And like the fact that I found shame or indicators of shame among people who identify as collectors and like are comfortable with that label is just kind of very fascinating. So I can imagine that people who resist the label will be even more kind of interesting to talk to around those kind of notions. So absolutely, I think that it was something that I was trying when I was doing my sampling, when I was trying to find people to interview, where I was like, I don't know whether this is the correct term to use. I don't know whether we should be even referring to it as this. I just wanted to kind of cast my net very wide, but what I ended up with was a sample of people who were comfortable with the term collector. So yeah, definitely, I think that if people, have are considering themselves art buyers and not collectors, I think that's a fascinating kind of internal dynamic to investigate as well.
Mhm. Personally, because I'm a bit of an art collector as well, and I have to declare a vested interest. I was one of the interviewees, but I've always collected all my life, and I started collecting at the age of 6. I was collecting stickers, commercial stickers, and things like that. So I've never personally identified with this guilt thing because there was no monetary value to me as a child that I was aware of anyway, in terms of, as I said, I was basically collecting because that's what a lot of children do. And so I think it's an interesting thing, and I think it's an interesting conversation to see maybe the difference between people who've collected all their life, and we could go into the psychological reasons for that, and in terms of loss and replacement and things like that. And I don't think I suffered any of that, but who knows? To maybe late comers into this collecting bug that some people would acquire later in life. So I think that's an interesting thing, maybe that it could be surveyed as well. How long have you been a collector, and have you collected anything before collecting art? And I think that could be an interesting conversation, but possibly one that you already had yourself.
Yeah, it was one of my questions that I had. I had a selection of questions that I would ask people, and I would kind of drift through them organically. And one of the questions that I had was, did you ever collect something before? So I could kind of see if there was this like urge to accumulate. It's not something that I found any kind of indicator for, but I think that it's really interesting. Like I was saying to Keely, that it can surface later, and it's not this immediately apparent love of art, and you're an art lover through and through, and that is who you are, and that just leads you to collections. So yeah, it's something. It's. I think I have more questions now than when I started, which is I think the way the research anyway goes. So, but yeah, definitely interested in like how the ins and like the demographics of people who start collecting and that kind of stuff, when in their life, and what's the path towards it. So in the future, hopefully something I might look into.
Very interesting subject. Anybody else has any questions?
Yeah, Ciara, nice to meet you in person. I'm just wondering, this resistance to the term collector, art collector, do you think there's something specifically Irish about this? Is it something with maybe Ireland being a post-colonial nation, maybe not the most developed visual culture, art schools, and maybe the fact that for most of the history of the state, the major art collections were housed in the big Protestant houses. Do you think there's any connection there? Is there something specifically Irish about this sort of maybe this resistance to this label, art collector?
Okay, I think that's an interesting thought. Just for the live again, the question is there something specifically Irish about the resistance to the term collector? I think possibly. I think that I interviewed mostly Irish people, but I think that there was kind of, from the non-Irish people, there was an appreciation of this country isn't really developed in terms of art. So is it specifically to do with Ireland? I can't say for sure because of the sample size and the sample composition, but definitely there was a very strong identification with middle and lower class people, that I just noticed casually, and I didn't get to investigate, but there was a very strong, I came from a farming background, or this was my parents' jobs, what were very, very clearly intent on clarifying that they're not of this, say, generalizing the Protestant upper class that would have been surrounded by art. So possibly there's something there. Yeah, I think that if I was able to look into people from further afield, maybe that I could confirm that against the Irish cohort. But yeah, definitely notions of Irishness came into it, but obviously couldn't be compared because of what we had. But yeah, thank you for asking.
I think it could be interesting as well to look into this sort of shame feeling that some people have. And again, I'm talking about my own experience as a collector. Let's forget for a minute as an art collector. I started collecting stamps at a very early age, and certainly this was not something that I was ready to admit, because there is this notion out there, and I think that might apply to art, visual art as well, that collectors are strange people, you know, and there's definitely that notion out there that, and the more sort of specific the collection is, that you might come across as a weird person. And I think, you know, so I think we should not possibly dismiss that notion as well, that whatever the object of the collection is, there is this sense of shame or guilt, because it's not something that a lot of people do. Even though, again, I think a lot of children collect, you know, and whether they, you know, it's conscientious or not, you know. So that's I think an interesting aspect as well of collecting in general. And
Absolutely.
what do you think about that?
So yeah, there was a specific consumer studies scholar that I've read for this, and Belk, and he says that the shame that comes with collecting is the connection to materialism. Now, what I found is the connection to elitism was the so-called source of shame in a lot of the collectors that I interviewed. So maybe it's different to regular collections, but something that came up was the notion of being an obsessive person. And if you look at, you know, studies that have observed that kind of behavior across more commercial collecting, like cars or stamps and that kind of stuff, then the suggestion is that a third of people collect, and that's a fairly stable statistic, but only 5% of people could be considered hoarders. So like 5% of those that collect could be considered hoarders, I believe. So the idea that such a small subset of the people that collect things could impact the way that the rest of the world sees collection, and could impact the way the rest of collectors see their collecting behavior, is really interesting, because it seems like such a natural human thing to do if a third of people are estimated to do it. So yeah, it's a really kind of interesting thing that we've attached so much shame to, whereas like in hunter-gatherer societies, the more you had, the better off you were for the winter. So like why have we attached shame to it? Yeah, it's a fascinating kind of connection that we've drawn. I don't know why that would be.
The other thing I was wondering about that came out in your study, because it's a conversation that I have with a lot of art buying people, or art collectors in some cases, is that some collectors, and I see them as collectors, don't see themselves as collectors simply because they haven't purchased a sufficient number of works. So there's an element of that whereby, and again, I would see them as collectors. You know, they don't feel they have, you know, they might only have 3 works in that collection. For me, it can be a collection which you can have a collection with just 3 works, but there is this element of that as well. You know, that collecting is all about numbers as well, and that comes in the conversation that I had at the gallery with people buying art. That's actually an interesting conversation that happens quite a lot. I don't know if this is something that came out in your survey as well.
It definitely is. I think I was referred to people by gallerists. So the gallerist would reproach somebody and say, "Hey, there's this student doing research on art collectors. Would you like to talk to her?" And then they'd come to me and they'd say, "Oh, I didn't even think of myself as an art collector. You know, it's just that the gallery has identified me as such." So the idea that the label is also, you know, imposed from the outside and then accepted is really interesting. But yeah, the notion of numbers is kind of like the question of who is an artist? Like, do they decide it themselves, Or is there, like, some people thought that maybe it wasn't numbers that made them a collector, but like a cohesive narrative between the pieces that they bought, or trying to come up with something that they, like a thread through their collection, but, or like a representation of their own tastes as well. So it had to be, again, this kind of notion of completion, like when is it a collection? What are the road markers in this thing? But well, when technically 2 pieces is a collection, 1 piece is a collection. So I think, yeah, it's definitely like a numbers game is an interesting kind of way to think about it, because art does resist those numbers, it resists prices, it resists all of these things. So it's an interesting way of, it's an interesting thing to quantify art buying as a collection. So yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I think that's everyone. I think that's everyone.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thanks a lot, Keely and Ciara. It's a fascinating subject. I know obviously the dissertation is out there. Could people actually ask for a copy of it? Is it something that they might ask, or?
Yeah, people are interested, I'd be happy to.
Brilliant. So you can contact us at the gallery if this is of interest. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation. I think we could go on and on about it. I've just seen another question here, and I don't know if we have time for that. Isn't there also an investment element here, financial gain? I think we just touch upon that.
I'll touch on it very quickly. For the 15 collectors that I interviewed, it was a very resistant. They were very resistant to this idea of financial gain. In fact, that's where a lot of the kind of notions of shame came from. Was this idea of being connected with somebody who's an investor in art. So it was seen as a very kind of Philistine or Philistinian kind of notion or motivation to art collect, and they weren't happy to be associated with that. So that's really, really interesting. I think that maybe there's something in my sampling there that maybe betrayed that. There was like a touch of it in some conversations where they would be like, I'd be crazy to not, keep an eye on the value of that work or the value of that artist, but I'm never selling it. Which is really, really fascinating that you can kind of consider value and consider economic value, but be separate to personal value and personal use and consumption. So yeah, there's an element there. I think that it's something we can dive into and further research more. But financial gain is something that people resist, which is really, really interesting.
Like that might be more applicable if you ever look into art buyers over collectors, because like I know there are a lot of, like, just personally, I know there are a lot of like art buyers who would be a lot more interested in the financial investment of a piece rather than the social relevance or the artist or even the artwork itself, and they see more as an investment because they wouldn't be as deep into the art world or the community, or wouldn't have like the jargon that's associated with talking about art or understanding art, and might not have the familiarization of the cultural capital that collectors might have. So yeah, I feel like if you're ever going to look into art buyers and collectors, that's probably more applicable there.
Absolutely.
But yeah,
I'd be delighted to talk to people who see it from both sides, or see it from one side or the other. I think definitely the way that I sampled my group of collectors might have affected the kind of people that I got in. But thank you for your question.
thank you.
Great. Listen, thanks a lot. Thanks to all of you that have attended, have been here in the gallery and attending the session today. Again, thanks a million, Ciara and Keely, for this fascinating conversation. And I'm sure, there will be more talks about it. And I'm sure if people have more questions that we can answer later as well, don't hesitate to send those questions as well. And we'll try our best. Or Ciara will try her best to answer them. Thanks a million again, and have a lovely weekend. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.